Hey guys, and welcome to the Stand Up Review podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Today we're reviewing Kevin Hart's 2019 special Irresponsible. Let's get into it. This podcast is brought to you by our patrons. If you want to help support the podcast, then head on over to patreon.com/standupreview. With tiers starting at as little as £1, there are some great benefits, such as voting for which specials you want reviewed, Q&As, bloopers, early access to podcasts, exclusive podcasts, and many more. Sign up at patreon.com/standupreview, and thank you for your support. Starting off with a little bit of background on Kevin Hart, he is of course a hugely successful comedian and actor. I'd be surprised if there are many people who don't know who he is. He has a lot of previous stand-up specials before this one, and of course he's been in a ton of films. He's extremely well known for his acting. Apparently I've seen one of his shows before. My girlfriend says I've watched one with her, but I don't remember it at all, and I've definitely not seen this show before. But generally I'm a fan of his films, and I'm aware of his general kind of comedy. In terms of his style, there's a lot of storytelling and there's a lot of performance comedy in there. He brings through his acting quite a lot. But with all that out of the way, let's get into the show itself. At the start of the show, Kevin gives a small introduction, but the annoying part here is that he spends a lot of time saying let's get into the show rather than just getting into it. I say a lot of time, it's not that bad, it's just quite annoying. The first bit, he talks about a time his kids caught him and his wife fucking. He tells the story well, he links off into some other side stories and side jokes, and there's a little bit of acting in there, but it doesn't take away from the jokes at all. The only real problem here is that he doesn't always get to the point. The bit probably goes on a little bit longer than it needs to because he sets the scene a little bit too much, but it's still very funny. He goes on to talk about his kids more generally, and what I noticed in this bit is he's very good at using the acting and the performance to fit the flow of the jokes and to work alongside the joke, while still managing to prioritise the actual jokes themselves over the performance aspect. But it's usually not for me the kind of acting side of comedy, but he does it really well here. After that he talks about his marriage, and he makes some serious points, but he manages to keep it funny. He doesn't change the tone of the show at all. But again, there's a little bit too much explanation between the jokes for me. It can take you out of the show at times, and some of the jokes don't quite hit as they're supposed to because he's kind of taking you out of the show with the lack of jokes for periods of time. After this, he talks about his wife's porn, and for me, this bit is very overperformed. There are some good jokes in there, but it just relies a little bit too much on the performance. This is also the case as he goes on to talk about having a third child, and it's probably what you should expect from him. It's what he's known for, is his kind of acting and performance, but it's just not for me. It's definitely not bad, and if you're into that sort of thing, it's a really good bit, but for me, it's just, you need to focus on the actual jokes themselves. He then talks about the difference between mums and dads. And again, there are some great jokes in there. When the jokes are good, they're really good. But they just don't come often enough. He's got too much filler with either jokes that he knows aren't great, or he's setting up the scene a little bit too much. And for me, he just needs to cut to the really good jokes. Again, it's fine to set a little bit of a scene, and not all of the jokes have to be top quality, but he's a good writer. He's capable of these good jokes. He's capable of knitting them together well. He shows it in other bits, but he just doesn't do it throughout the full show for me. The next story is about a friend's baby that he calls Great Baby. This is a really good bit. It's really well told, really well written. He's not relying on the performance aspect anywhere near as much here. He ends it with a really good callback to a joke earlier in the bit. For me, this is one of the better parts of the show, and this is what I would love to see from him throughout the whole show. In the next bit, it's a very different bit. He plays out people breaking into his house. He sort of performs several little mini scenes with some background music over it. But this is really well done, and the difference here is this bit is based around performance. The whole point is that he's performing out these little scenes. And it's different to using performance in the place of a joke because the performance is the joke. It's the whole point of the bit. Obviously, he's a great performer. He knows what he's doing. He can act out these scenes really well. And it's a really fun section of the show. It's still funny. It's just he's not trying to replace a joke with the performance. He's actually acting out the joke. So it's still not really my thing, but it's a really good part of the show. He goes on to talk about game night at his house. There's not a whole lot to say. It's not the longest bit. It's really funny. There's some great jokes in there. And there's nothing wrong with a shorter bit where it's just some good jokes. The story is still an important part of the bit. I'm not really sure how you could tell the jokes without having the story behind it. Or at the very least, the story sort of enhances the jokes. So again, this is a really good bit. He then kind of links this into a story about a trip to Japan. There's a really great joke at the start of this bit. And it's quite funny. It's not the best bit in the show, but it's not bad. It's probably about half the course of the show. But the bit that stands out really for me here is there's a little bit of audience participation. He kind of just says something to a member of the audience, but the audience member responds quite well. They play off each other quite well, and I don't want to say it makes the bit funnier, but it certainly made that section of audience participation funnier. So at least that one particular audience member did a really good job there. And the show ends with him talking about a skiing trip he went on. This bit is filled with some really good callbacks to earlier in the show. It's a really funny story and a funny bit in its own right. He ends the show with a great callback. And for me, this is a brilliant example of how to end a show. He kind of ties up a few of the other stories. It's a solid story in itself. If we put this bit in the middle of the show, without the callbacks, it would still be good. And he's got a really solid joke to end the show on. For me, this is a great example of how to end a show. And it really leaves you walking away from it or turning the TV off with a really good memory of the show. So a few little extra things to mention. In terms of callbacks, they're mostly towards the end of the show. There are one or two earlier in the show. But when he does use them, he keeps them very brief, but they're really well used. They'll be the punchline of a joke, and they won't just be for the sake of calling back to something earlier in the show. It'll actually be a funny joke where the callback makes sense as a punchline. With regards to transitions, there are some really great transitions. The show in general is structured really well. The bits blend together pretty much perfectly, and the whole arc of the show tells a really good story. And then his stage persona, it's somewhat self-deprecating, but it's extremely confident. Kevin Hart's a born performer. He's already got a public persona through his acting and his earlier comedy work. And he kind of has to stick with it, but it works for his comedy. So he's kind of set himself this persona that I assume isn't too far from his real self, but it works really well for the show, so there's no complaints there. As far as the audience goes, Kevin Hart's a big name. The crowd know what to expect from him. He's a well-known public figure, so of course he gets a good crowd. One problem with the show is that because it's quite a big arena, the audience are quite difficult to hear throughout the show. It means they don't really impact it positively or negatively, but it kind of dampens the mood of the show a little bit. There are a few kind of overlaps towards the start of the show, but he's a big American comedian performing in London, so the crowd might just be excited to see him. But overall, as I said before, the audience don't really affect the show in any way. It's kind of fine. The only problem is that it doesn't really feel like a big comedy show because that lack of background audience noise isn't really there. So to finish with some overall thoughts, this show is really, really good in places, but it's also really bad in places. There's a little bit too much serious speech, quite a bit of repetition in the jokes, and he spends a lot of time setting up jokes, which is fine when the joke is worth it at the end, but some of the jokes are just far too weak for the amount of setup he gives them. But when the show is good, it is a brilliant, brilliant show in parts. One of the funniest shows I've seen in certain parts. The ending of the show is really strong, so the last 15 minutes or so is amazing, and that really gives you a good impression of the show as you leave it, but earlier parts of the show are really bad. If you're a fan of Kevin Hart's films or his general kind of performance comedy, then I would highly recommend it. If you're a comedy fan more broadly, or perhaps more of a traditional stand-up fan perhaps, I would still say to give the show a watch, but don't be expecting it to be brilliant for the whole hour. If you ask me, this could have been a really, really good half hour, one of the better half hours out there. But to give it an overall rating, I would still give it a 7 out of 10. It's still worth giving a watch. Thanks for listening to the Stand Up Review podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, be sure to subscribe to get new episodes as soon as they come out every Monday, Wednesday and Friday. Check out our Patreon for some awesome benefits at patreon.com/standupreview. If you have any thoughts or suggestions for the show, whether it be a new segment or a show you'd like us to review, let us know on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter at standupreview and give us a follow while you're over there. Feel free to share this or any of our other podcasts on any social media platform. Have a great day and we'll see you for the next episode.